Welcome to Market Shapers, a podcast about harnessing capitalism for good. I'm Inder Singh. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with incredible people, building products, forging deals, and shaping markets that have impacted millions of lives. On this show, I sit down with the leaders, innovators, and behind-the-scenes deal makers who've changed the way markets work, often in ways most people never see. We'll unpack how they did it, what they learned, and how those lessons can help tackle the big challenges ahead. My guest today is Rich Powell, CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. Rich and CEBA are quietly shaping clean energy markets. CEBA's members include some of the world's largest companies and the world's largest electricity buyers. Together, they've formed a coordinated effort that has contracted more clean energy than any U.S. state. It's also accelerating the entry of new technologies like geothermal and advanced nuclear. And this group includes companies you probably wouldn't expect to be advancing the cause for clean energy. Prior to the Clean Energy Buyers Association, Rich was the CEO of ClearPath and worked in McKinsey's sustainability practice. Rich, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, and really excited to be here.
Let's talk about CEBA. What is CEBA's mission? Can you tell us what problem you're specifically trying to solve?
Sure. So the Clean Energy Buyers Association is a business association, and then our institute is a related nonprofit think tank that are focused on driving low-cost, reliable, carbon emissions-free energy systems globally. And the way we do that is we work with our members, and those are the largest buyers of electricity in the United States and increasingly the largest buyers of electricity around the world, both to leverage their collective buying power to drive more clean energy on systems and to leverage their collective voice to advocate for new business models and new voluntary standards and new policies that move entire markets, not just our members' specific energy footprints.
Rich, I want to go back to a TED Talk that you gave a couple years ago.
You're the one who watched it. I get a ping when it happens.
You argued in that TED Talk, and I'm going to quote you here, "Free markets deploy clean capital faster than any other force," end quote. You also argued that, quote, "ending capitalism is deeply irresponsible to both environmental progress and human flourishing." Now, you're working with businesses, large businesses across the globe. Does this mean that you are a capitalist? And how do you respond to those people who see capitalism as incompatible with climate justice?
I am a capitalist and a proud capitalist. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time defending capitalism's record on lifting people out of poverty and making economies that are wealthy enough to start to really worry about the second order problems of environmental quality and then the third order problems. I've actually spent, through some of my previous experiences, a fair amount of time in post-Soviet situations, and I have seen the utter environmental devastation that centrally planned economies can wreak on their environments and on their populations. I've seen real environmental injustice in those places. And so I do think that capitalism is the force that it has and continues to lift people around the world out of poverty, and that's going to enable us to afford the things we'll need to do to go all the rest of the way to achieve a global economy that's ultimately clean and that works just as well for our ecosystems as it does for humanity. And we're going to get there. We're already a lot of the way there, right? In the developed world, traditional environmental pollution is dramatically down. Conservation outcomes are dramatically up. Species are protected. Here on the East Coast of the United States, we live in remarkably clean air that our friends in Europe actually find admirable. And, clearly we still have some problems, though, some really significant problems. CO2 and the other greenhouse gases, there are still a lot of ecosystems in the world that are critically endangered, but the trends are moving in the right direction.
So, Rich, let's take the other side of the coin, the other position. If markets, for those people who might be described as pure capitalists, if markets function so well, why hasn't the market delivered faster on things like clean power or long duration storage? Why is there a need for organizations like CEBA?
So in my view, being a capitalist doesn't mean that you are focused solely or maniacally on market forces and market interactions. There are all kinds of things that markets traditionally haven't been able to do well alone. I mean, the example I always point to, you look at the most important energy development so far of the late 20th and early 21st century, which was the US opening up the shale gas revolution, which has totally rebalanced the US energy situation. But the shale gas revolution was unleashed by a grand public-private partnership that wasn't just driven by the private sector. At the time, the private oil and gas industry was really focused on something that ended up being, pun intended, sort of a dry well. They were focused on terrestrial, ultra-deep drilling. It was the Department of Energy that seeded a program with a really visionary oil guy in Texas named George Mitchell and Mitchell Energy that opened up shale gas. It was the Department of Energy that helped pioneer the horizontal drilling and 3D seismic imaging and diamond-headed drill bits and hydraulic fracturing, and then the combined cycle gas turbines that all that was attached to, that has delivered low-cost, highly reliable, heavily decarbonized power from the coal that it was replacing in the U.S. economy. That was a public-private partnership. A very similar story, obviously, to solar energy, which I think so far I'd say is the second most important breakthrough. It is probably rapidly becoming the most important breakthrough in the 21st century. And obviously that'll be true of fusion and advanced nuclear. So especially in the energy sector, where you've got huge capital intensive project profiles, the ability of innovators to take big risks alone without some kind of government support or intervention as they did that is frankly very, very limited, especially given the really long-term nature of the capital investments and the low risk profile of a lot of the investors in the industry. So I do see a robust role for government in shaping and supporting policy and innovation. And then obviously what we can do at organizations like CEBA or the other organizations that are trying to use collective buying powers is we can also help shape those markets in ways that aren't traditionally what you would say is just pure market competition for new technologies, right? Like people can collaborate to the greatest extent allowable by law, very important caveat, right? For a trade organization like mine, people can collaborate in ways that create market signals for things that, otherwise might kind of look pre-commercial or pre-economic and really drive those things forward.
So we're getting into market shaping concepts. And here you're talking about push funding from government, right? So like supporting major infrastructure projects or R&D activities. And it seems like you're talking a little bit about pull mechanisms where you're sending demand signals. You believe both are necessary,
Yes.
push and the pull.
Yes.
And on the pull side, it sounds like you're talking about a buying club where you identify early adopters of a new technology, potentially rally them around a specific target product profile that they all agree we want this. Is that right? Is that what's happening in climate today?
Certainly in the US power sector, that is happening, and increasingly in the global power sector. So, you have major corporate buyers of electricity, and we buy, a really non-trivial portion of the national electricity supply in the United States. It's a little hard to pin down, especially as the market is rapidly growing, but let's call it between 15 and 20% of,
Wow.
US electricity is bought by very large companies. And, we're talking about companies that some of whom have electricity demand the size of small countries, right? And so this really started in the early 21st century when a few companies, and particularly pioneers, Walmart, Google, and General Motors, made some kind of close in time together commitments to buy clean electricity. They said on some timeline, we're 100% of the electricity that we buy for our company is going to be clean electricity. And that sent a very large signal out to the market. And this is way before any of the utilities were voluntarily saying this. These very large companies said, we're going to do this over some time horizon. Some of them had pretty distant time horizons, like 2040. Some of them had much nearer term time horizons, like 2030 or even 2025. And as that started to happen, it was like a very useful snowball. More and more companies went out and made these commitments. We call it the corporate demand market or the corporate PPA, power purchase agreement market, which has become quite robust. As of the end of 2024, our members in the US had contracted for 100 gigawatts of clean electricity so far, just in the US alone, and at least another 150 or so globally. That was across all carbon emissions free types. So in the early days, our members bought a lot of wind. Solar then gradually became the preeminent technology. Last year, nuclear and geothermal were purchased at scale for the first time. We actually bought more nuclear last year than wind. So that's kind of an interesting new development. And so it's sort of across all technology types, but now people know that there's this market. And if you take that 100 gigawatts, so like what we've contracted for so far, and you were to compare that by capacity to US states, we're the largest state. California, for example, that has a commitment to going 100% clean is a smaller total capacity than that figure. It's like we've created another state that's moving faster than the rest of the states and is actually growing. We're just getting started. We think there's at least another 175 gigawatts for us to buy in the US alone by 2035, just to satisfy the demands of our membership. And that's before you incorporate really robust new electricity demand growth. We're collectively something like the size of the Italian power market right now, not just the clean part, but like the whole Italian power market. So it's a powerful instrument when you can add that signal. Back to my point about capitalism being the most important thing, as we're seeing now in the United States, the policy winds come and go, right? You see rising and sometimes ebbing enthusiasm for the project of clean electricity from a policy perspective, and a rising and falling willingness to pay for the project of the clean electricity transition or the carbon emissions reduction transition. The corporate demand signal in the background, we think, can send a much more durable market signal that can be the steady eddy, if you will, as the US political pendulum sort of swings back and forth.
Durable because these are actual customers. You're committing to a long-term purchase.
Yeah.
So, Rich, I'm sure for some of the listeners out there, it makes sense why California, a progressive state, is politically motivated to make policies around clean energy. But why are these companies that are economically driven willing to make these commitments? Is it because they're progressive and they believe it's the right thing to do? In most of these cases, I would imagine that the early purchasing of these clean energy solutions are higher in price than the others, or is that not the case?
So it really all depends on how you look at it. So I guess let me start by saying a lot of companies do this for a whole bunch of different reasons. Clearly, I think some of the companies in the CEBA membership could be described as progressive, and other ones I think would, we have aerospace and defense contractors and semiconductor manufacturers and major retailers. We have major petrochemical companies that I think most folks would look at the brands and say, I wouldn't just traditionally describe those as progressive companies. A number of things are at play here. A number of the companies do have genuine commitments to reducing their carbon emissions or reducing the share of the electricity that they're procuring from high emitting resources. Some of them have a genuine interest in pushing forward new technologies that are good for all kinds of reasons. In some cases, not just because they're good for carbon emissions reduction, but because they're incredibly energy dense. Like, for example, the new nuclear and geothermal procurements are interesting to a lot of companies for a lot of reasons. They also might be technologies that could be deployed in more places, maybe even in off-grid situations that would enable and open up new business models for them. There's also the way we procure clean electricity by and large, the sort of the deal technology, if you will, that's become most commonly adopted amongst our memberships is a virtual power purchase agreement. And with a VPPA, you get to make a really long-term, clear commitment to buying electricity at a particular price. So it's called your strike price. And often you do that for 15 or 20 years. In return for making that commitment, so I'm going to pay, I'm a very large electricity consumer, I'm going to pay you, developer of this, let's call it solar project, $55 a megawatt hour, maybe plus inflation year on year, something like that, over the next 20 years. In exchange, what you're going to send back to me is the returns you make from actually physically selling that electricity into the power markets, plus the renewable energy certificates that you generate by selling that power. So I get back whatever the difference is between that fixed price you're taking it. And so what I'm effectively doing, in addition to getting those renewable energy certificates, is I am sort of purchasing a hedge against future electricity price increases. And that deal has become a very standard deal because that is the way that a lot of companies can get their chief financial officers and their treasuries to yes, it's not just that they're paying more for electricity. It's that actually, if electricity prices go up in the future, remember, I'm getting back those market returns from that project. And so I'm actually in some way hedged against those future electricity prices that I'm going to have to pay elsewhere when I'm directly procuring electricity elsewhere in the markets. And so that approach has been a really useful approach. It's lending our balance sheets. And obviously we have some of the largest companies in the country, so they have very large, very creditworthy balance sheets. We're lending those balance sheets and the long-term creditworthy offtake, which then enable the developers who in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, wouldn't have the balance sheets themselves to go out and attract commercially feasible, debt. So in so doing, we're actually lowering the cost of clean electricity because they're able to take that long-term creditworthy offtake, go and get reasonable financing terms, and we enable clean electricity that's cheaper than it would have been otherwise if they were just trying to do this in the market and they had to go and secure much more expensive debt. So it's a long way of saying there are circumstances where this can be more expensive than buying traditional electricity from the grid. There are also circumstances where it can be a helpful hedge and we can even save money from doing this. But what it certainly does is it lowers the cost of produced clean electricity on an individual project level basis. And then because the whole movement is doing this as a group of companies, we're creating the broader demand signal that then allows the rest of the supply chain to start making serious investments in more whatever, nuclear reactor fabrication sites or inverters for the power electronics that go into the batteries that are attached to the solar facilities or larger and larger wind turbine blade manufacturing. And that too helps lower and drive down the cost of all of this. And so, again, we're capitalists. We're not excited about paying more for clean electricity forever. In fact, we actually think we've meaningfully helped reduce the cost of clean electricity across the whole space to the point where it's actually, in many circumstances, quite cost effective. And then the nice thing about the way we're procuring in all of these cases with these really long-term fixed priced offtakes is the power markets as they exist today in the US, the deregulated power markets are by design highly variable. For example, when the price of natural gas spikes in the US power markets, which thankfully it does less now because we had the shale gas revolution, but in the tragic Russian invasion of Ukraine, which then upended sort of the European gas market and then upended global gas markets, we saw rapid intense spikes in the cost of gas and therefore the price of electricity in so much of the United States, which is now highly dependent on gas-fired power generation. And our folks that had done these VPPAs were nicely hedged against those price spikes. So almost all of the carbon emissions-free technologies are much more upfront capital intensive, so CapEx expensive, but much more kind of OpEx light, right? If they have fuel costs, those fuel costs are a much smaller part of the overall cost of running those plants. So like in nuclear, for example, like a nuclear reactor only has to refuel every 3 years. The nuclear fuel costs are almost de minimis relative to the cost of operating the whole thing, which is very, very different than, let's say, gas-fired generation, where it's like 1/3 CapEx, 2/3 OpEx. Like the economics of those plants really live or die by the trading cost of natural gas, the availability of natural gas in the US. Also, one thing, especially very large companies hate is risk and uncertainty. We love long-term clarity as much as possible that you can then plan all kinds of other major capital expenses around, like spending, say, $100 billion on building out a fleet of AI data centers or massive new semiconductor manufacturing or huge new, chemical facilities in Texas and elsewhere. And so if you can sort of pretty clearly pencil in your electricity prices over the next 20 years, that then starts to allow a lot of other blocks to fall into place when you're financing a mega project.
That was incredibly helpful, Rich, to walk through that. Let me try to play that back to make sure I've captured it. So it sounds like there's two major buckets for why these companies are willing to commit. One is a strategic bucket, which is, hey, there are certain attributes of the new power source that are strategically advantageous to me. An example might be I have a data center and I need a concentration of energy in that location. That's perhaps a little different than purchasing it off the grid, right? That's one simple example. So there's strategic instance. And then on the other hand, there's a financial de-risking approach because you're essentially forward pricing and committing to a specific price that enables you to hedge against fluctuations in pricing and potentially takes advantage, at least in some instances, of the different economic structure of these clean energy technologies. And providing those virtual private contracts to clean energy suppliers enables them to finance those big infrastructure projects upfront, either through those contracts or through other financing because they now have a committed price. Did I capture that in a reasonable way?
You were so much more articulate than I was.
I was trying to simplify it, and I don't think I simplified it. But anyway, thank you for the compliment.
I wish it were simpler. So the upside is that transaction works for a lot of buyers. The downside is what we just described in a line down is a complex transaction and very different than, just going to your local utility and buying electricity from the grid. And so a lot of what CEBA has actually done over the past 6 years as we've been a freestanding organization, and then in the predecessor projects, the NGOs that were previously run on this approach, is we actually really had to spend a lot of time educating and training new buyers on how to take advantage of that elegant but relatively complicated deal technology, right? So we literally have boot camps where we bring people together, and senior buyers that have done a whole bunch of these transactions, along with lawyers and other advisors, get together and, with kind of curricula that we have refined over years, we educate new generations. So either I'm a new company coming into the space fresh. My favorite example I always go to is that Cheesecake Factory is a relatively new member of CEBA and a relatively new buyer that's getting ready to transact for the first time, and we're delighted to have them. And they're kind of being educated by folks from massive data center companies and lawyers that have done a ton of these transactions before on how to actually do this, because then that person is going to have to go and make the case to a whole bunch of folks in their company about why they're going to go and do this totally new thing. And so they're going to have to sell this to their chief financial officer because they're making kind of a long-term financial commitment on behalf of the organization. They're going to have to talk to their operations team about like how this thing interacts with the actual physical electricity buying for the rest of the organization. And then they're going to have to talk to the sustainability team about what it means that now they're going to be acquiring this long-term stream of energy attribute certificates, or in this case, if it's a nuclear project, the zero emission certificates. If it's a renewable project, the renewable energy certificates. But those are going to be the things that you get back from this project that sort of are the proof that you helped generate new clean power over here. And then you can use those things in your reporting and disclosure, because many companies now do some kind of sustainability reporting.
Outside of a regulatory need to report that or to be under a particular bar because you're offsetting your emissions with these certificates, outside of that, is there economic value to that? Like outside of regulatory compliance?
Yeah, there is. So a couple of things. One, there's a whole class of investors that have made the decision for whatever reason that they want to be sustainable investors. And so index funds have been developed and asset managers have been formed around that investing thesis. Some of those people are doing it because they purely think that it's just the right thing to do and they want to express a value system as a part of investing. And obviously they're free to do that. We're all free to do that. And then other folks strongly believe that the more sustainable a company is, the more it's likely to be set up for long-term financial success, because sustainability practices and reporting and accounting within a company often also tend to be indicators of all kinds of other sort of operational excellence. Like if you really, really have a handle on how much electricity you're using, for example, that typically means you have your house very strongly in order across your entire footprint, and you're very closely monitoring all kinds of costs, and you're going to be well situated to weather whatever kind of change, disaster, happens and hits your business, right? So that's kind of the other piece of the sustainable investing thesis. And then obviously, if you believe that there's going to be stronger and stronger policy over time to reduce emissions, you're also sort of getting ahead of that. You're prepaying for your compliance costs, even if you're not today subject to those regulatory costs. There are also specific markets for services that are performed with lower CO2 costs. So, for example, A number of our companies operate cloud services that they then open up to other people, right? So if you don't want to have your own data center fleet, you can buy compute and cloud storage space from a number of the large hyperscaler companies that are in our membership. And many of the folks that want to go and build their digital businesses on top of those platforms actually themselves care about what quality of compute they're buying. And they would prefer to buy compute that's lower CO2 emissions because the electricity that's going into it is lower CO2 emissions. Then obviously a lot of consumers care about that a lot as well.
Rich, so this service that you provide to new companies to teach them how to contract for this, how to go about the internal sales process for getting the CFO and everybody else on board, how old is this approach? Who really pioneered this kind of approach? And I imagine it's been pieced together over time.
Yeah. I'm the third person who's had the privilege of being in this role at CEBA, and every one of us keeps on the wall an agenda, which was the agenda and list of attendees of a meeting that occurred now about 13 years ago in 2012, held in Washington, D.C. At the time, in 2012, this is kind of wild to think, so only 13 years ago, only 3 companies had voluntarily transacted renewable electricity in the United States. And that was Walmart and Google and General Motors. But there were a number of other companies that were very interested in this and exploring creating their own goals. And so people from all 3 of those companies are still very involved in CEBA today, 13 years later. And then a number of other companies joined that meeting, a number of other NGOs and some power producers and utilities who were interested in getting this thing going joined that as well. And so this process then of standardizing and normalizing that deal technology, educating a very broad cross-section of companies about how to do it, normalizing the idea that not only would you do this accounting, but then you would set some kind of aspirational goal to do the purchasing. CEBA and its kind of predecessor NGOs were in the middle of all that. And going from those 3 companies, today we've had 235 companies in the US that have transacted some volume in some way of clean electricity. And we've gone from a couple dozen megawatts to now 100 gigawatts. And so that's like 3 orders of magnitude up from those early purchases, which is really exciting. The original 4 NGOs that started those projects and were working with companies were the Rocky Mountain Institute and its Business Renewable Center, the World Resources Institute, who also maintains the accounting system, so the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, BSR, Business or Social Responsibility, and then WWF with the World Wildlife Fund and their U.S. program. So those were sort of the 4 NGOs that were working with all this. And then around 2018, the companies came together and said, we'd actually like this to be one integrated organization. For this kind of thing, it makes sense for that to be a trade association. But then we also built a C3 alongside it, an institute, because the point of this was to leverage all of this to fully make grids clean around the world. And so the C3 Institute we built alongside it focuses on bringing all this out to the rest of the world and sort of advocating for policy change, educating policymakers about how to open up markets and how to enable this sort of thing, both in the US and then in countries around the world.
It sounds like you've got deal technology, the influence and education of your members, policy levers as kind of the big strategic levers that you're deploying. In market shaping, there's this concept of a market orchestrator. And I don't want to use that term for CE buyers because I know that you're constrained by certain legal limitations, but you are organizing the demand side of the market. So what are the lessons or things that CE buyers is doing that you would like to communicate that others can learn from, especially if they're thinking about shaping markets in other sectors?
Yeah, one of the fastest places that we're expanding is our global program. And so we have a number of our member companies that either themselves have really large global footprints or that have supply chains with really large global footprints are now thinking about not just their own US electricity consumption and the quality of that consumption or their European consumption or whatever, but like, what does our electricity supply or our supply chain's electricity supply look like in Vietnam or in key states in India or in Indonesia and other kind of rapidly developing markets? Those are very, very coal intensive markets and not even terribly efficient new coal plants. They're often kind of pretty outdated coal plants that run with low efficiency, high cost, and very high emissions. And so our members are keen to see other options stood up in those regions where at the very least they'd be modern power plants, right? That, operated with high efficiency and lower cost. And so one thing we're doing in many of those markets is, you go into those markets, you start to engage buyers in those markets and say, hey, if you're going to be selling to me, whatever it is, those textiles or those semiconductors or whatever, I'd prefer you, supplier, to also be supplied by clean electricity. And then that supplier goes to their local grid and the local grid says, I don't know what you're talking about. We have this one kind of power and yeah, it's really energy intensive, but we got a lot going on here. And so this is what we've got. We then can go using the collective voice of our very large customers to the governments in those countries and say, hey, what would you think about creating a new policy which started to open up these markets and recognizing you've got to run a stable grid here. We don't want to disrupt that in any way. But what if, in addition to you running that grid, if one of our members wanted to put in a something right next to their facility, a solar facility with batteries or fuel cells running off of natural gas or whatever, that was lower cost and reliable and lower emissions, shouldn't they be allowed to do that? And often that takes an act of that country. So in Vietnam, for example, the government there, they call it a decree. So the government had to issue a decree saying that you could do direct power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements that were different than just dealing with their state-owned utility. So that came through last year. And so I think that that's another interesting thing that groups can collectively do is they can leverage their collective voice to create new market opportunities in new geographies that often today are, don't currently exist. The legal structure, the business structure for them doesn't exist.
It also reflects the fact, I think, Rich, you tell me, that a lot of the ability to influence markets is derived from the buying power of the customers. And when there's higher buying power, there's an ability to influence stakeholders in a much bigger way. And if there's one lesson, I think, in market shaping, it's like you got to aggregate demand to some level so that you have some level of influence.
That's right. And in many of these countries, we can go in and we can, I think the group of companies that we bring to some of these countries is a very non-trivial share of their total exports, which in turn is often a very non-trivial share of their GDP.
How do you avoid the risk of concentrating too much of the agenda setting in the power of a few? Is there a way that you handle that? Are you worried about that? Is that a concern?
Yeah, it is a concern, right? What we've done as an organization is attempted to create as a set of rules and practices and norms that try to create as large a tent as possible for as many buyers as possible. In some sense, just the existence of the thing is inherently democratic, right? People are welcoming in new participants to a market who they know will compete against them for buying power, right? So that itself is kind of interesting, right? We're welcoming in competition and we've set up a whole structure where we're training competition for power. So that's interesting. But we also make sure that in our various decision committees and bodies that we've got a broad representation of membership. The CEBA Executive Committee has the nation's largest retailer, two of the nation's largest data center operators, one of our largest manufacturers, and a clean energy developer, somebody who advises and transacts in a lot of different kinds of things, and then, an NGO representative and myself. So we try to make sure that the decision-making bodies are broadly representative of the membership, even if arguably, at least in the past couple of years, the buying has been skewed in one of our subsectors.
Given the shifts in how climate's being discussed politically, are you seeing CEBA members pull back from any earlier commitments or reframe the positioning? For example, is it affecting the strength of the demand signals, or perhaps it's reducing the premium members might be willing to pay? Or is it just a reframing, which is like, we're just not going to use certain words. We're going to have the same commitment because strategically and economically it makes sense, but we're going to just change the wording. Are you seeing any of that happening given the current political climate?
We've not seen a change in people's fundamental commitments on all these things. I think that there are folks who are looking at their existing commitments and they're saying, oh, I don't know if I'd be able to do the same thing on the same timeline given changes that have now happened. Unfortunately, in U.S. political dialogue, we go back and forth on favored technologies. So the previous administration decided that it really did not like natural gas exploration and oil exploration. And so at the very end of the administration, it sort of banned new offshore oil and gas exploration. So in applying equal and opposite force, this new administration has come in and said, well, we're going to effectively do the same thing to a lot of new wind development around the country. Both of these things are very bad from our perspective, right? So we've got members who'd love to see new gas-fired plants with carbon capture as part of the national electricity fleet, and that would decarbonize the fleet. And we've got other members that would love to see more wind come onto the system. And so, the pendulum swinging back and forth has kind of put both of those things at some considerable risk. And so when you look at that and you're like, well, okay, well, I was really planning to have X amount of wind in my portfolio in order to get me to meet my sustainability target on Y date, or I was really planning on having, a reliable source of natural gas for this facility, and I was going to put carbon capture on it. Now that's been endangered by the previous administration. That's the business uncertainty that then makes hitting the targets that we were hoping to hit less clear and more challenging than they were before. Thankfully, it seems like there are a few technologies, like nuclear in particular, that are just broadly popular. They seem like they're popular across all things. And so I do think one thing you're seeing is folks putting more of their chips on technologies that appear to have broad bipartisan support. You're seeing a lot of nuclear announcements these days. And I think it's because folks think that, okay, that's something where I've got reasonable certainty that no matter who's in control of Congress or in control of the White House, I'm going to have support in getting that done.
Are you seeing AI have a meaningful impact as yet in the acceleration or adoption of clean energy solutions? And what's your view on how AI is affecting the market, if at all?
So there's two different big dynamics here, right? So one is what's the power demand from AI that has to be supplied, ideally by new clean electricity. And then the second issue is AI itself having an impact on the technologies that are available or the demand signal itself for clean electricity. And I think the first we're absolutely seeing, and I think it's going to have a net strongly positive impact. The second, I think, is a little bit more speculative. So on the first side, the US grid in particular is finally growing again. If for the last 2 decades, the US electricity sector actually has been very flat, demand's been very flat. We've had very strong efficiency programs and in some cases mandates in place, which have decreased electricity consumption in a lot of sectors, particularly the residential sector. But that's also kind of hitting its asymptote. And then we have this growth in the data intensive economy and data centers. And obviously AI is the thing that's really driving that. It's also driving second order new electricity demand in that every one of those data centers consumes a lot of steel. That steel is usually created with an electric arc furnace. Every one of those new data centers is full of semiconductors, right? Those chips and the fabs that create those chips require massive, massive amounts of electricity themselves to stand up. Sometimes gigawatts of electricity. That'd be like the full output of a nuclear reactor themselves just to power those things at very high reliability. So AI is driving all of that, and is, I think, arguably right now the primary driver, or at least the single largest driver of electricity growth in the US. I'm very excited about all the benefits that'll come out of the AI itself. But what's interesting is you've got a situation now where electricity demand growth is being driven by a number of companies that are really interested in doing it with low carbon or carbon-free power, that have strong commitments in that regard, and that have, obviously, for everything we just discussed, very large balance sheets and a willingness to kind of take on, in many cases, higher technology risk in supplying those operations than maybe your average consumer-serving utility would be. And so that's driving some really cool innovation in the space. On the use of the AI itself to also drive change in the grid, I think we've got some really interesting anecdotes to date. So some of the new fusion companies, for example, have used early generation AI to help figure out some of the unbelievably complex math and physics that are going on inside of those tokamaks and all the other really cool devices that folks are trying to use to create a commercial fusion product. I also think that AI is going to be an incredibly helpful tool in managing the grid we have today. So you have a couple of companies that are using advanced optimization algorithms and AI to just try and help some of our major power markets figure out the way that they interconnect new resources and manage those grids. And lastly, and back to from my TED Talk, I'm obsessed with permitting. Permitting is just a classic use case for AI. Right. So, the idea that maybe rather than having to hire a law firm to take 6 months to do your NEPA application, you could just have a NEPA chatbot that has already absorbed every successful NEPA review ever. And if you just kind of input the specific parameters around your project that are different from about yours than all the other ones, that it could create that in minutes. And then you could review it in hours as opposed to spending months. And then on the reviewer side, you could have a federal government armed with the same that could rapidly analyze your NEPA submission in minutes as opposed to months, and maybe make a response in days as opposed to years. The opportunity for that is just spectacular. And I'm very excited that we could see a disruptively faster, simpler, cheaper permitting system that would deliver the same or better environmental outcomes than we currently have with a fraction of the time and friction that's currently required to do it. The Trump administration has already done an executive order which directs departments to start onboarding AI tools into their permitting processes. And obviously, you can never take, and by law, you cannot take humanity out of this process, right? Like, we have to be the people that are using expert opinion and a lot of judgment in deciding which of these. But boy, these tools can just massively speed up those processes. I'm really excited about that.
Last one, Rich. Is there a moment, quiet or dramatic, that reminds you why you continue to be committed to this work?
I had a really fun experience last summer. So one of our wonderful members, a small Seattle-based bookseller that has occasionally gotten into additional business lines called Amazon, made a commitment over at its headquarters. And I got to be a part of the commitment. I got to be part of the launch. And so what they announced last summer is that they were going to do for an advanced nuclear company what they had previously done for Rivian, the electric vehicle company. And so with Rivian, they said, hey, we're going to make an investment in Rivian, but we're also going to make a long-term buying commitment. We're going to buy 100,000 Rivian delivery trucks to help supplement our delivery fleet and to gradually make it over into electric vehicles, which I think was a pretty inspirational thing that they did. So they did a very similar thing with an advanced reactor company called X Energy. And they were going to make an investment in the company. And then they were going to make a long-term commitment to buying 5 gigawatts of X Energy plants over time. And it was particularly cool because X Energy exists as a going company right now because of a program that in my previous role at ClearPath, we helped set up called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program at the Department of Energy. But then Amazon is going to massively scale them up. So it was just really cool to be part of this event in public conversation with the CEO of X Energy and the head of the utilities in Virginia and the Northwest and the senators who were involved and a bunch of folks, just to kind of see all these different parts of the story come together from this company that I've been sort of tracking and as supportive of as possible through federal policy, all the way through its demonstration up to now having the largest buyer of electricity on the planet committing to buy an enormous amount of electricity. That was pretty cool. I wish more of those days came along. That's not every day, but that was a really good one. That'll keep me going for a few more years in this.
Very cool. Rich, you're doing amazing work. Thank you for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Really great discussion.
Thanks for listening to the Market Shapers podcast. I'm Inder Singh. If you enjoyed the show, please like it or leave us a review and subscribe in your favorite app so you don't miss the next episode. Market Shapers is produced by me with help from University FM. Special thanks to Renaissance Philanthropy, Griffin Catalyst, and the Digital Harbor Foundation for their support.